Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we aren't just discussing the creator of a fantasy. We are plunging into the mind of an architect, a cartographer, historian, and, well, a linguist. The man who quite literally built an entire fictional universe, brick by linguistic brick.
That's right. We're talking about John Ronald Reuel Tolkien.
J.R.R. Tolkien.
And he didn't just invent story. He undertook what he called subcreation, providing a world with a complete history, cosmology, languages, moral frameworks. I mean, it laid the entire foundation for modern fantasy fiction.
So our mission today is to synthesize the source, look at how his specific, quite unique life experiences, from early orphanhood to the trauma of the Somme, how they converged with his lifelong academic passion.
Philology, that's the key.
Exactly. Philology, how that all came together to create Middle-earth. Okay, let's unpack that central concept right away for you listening. We're calling him a philologist. What does that actually mean, and why is that academic label so vital to understanding his creative output?
Well, philology is essentially the study of language in its historical context.
Yeah.
You often look at ancient, sometimes forgotten text, and through the language, you try to reveal the history and culture of the spoken.
Sounds pretty intense.
Oh, it's an incredibly rigorous discipline. And for Tolkien, it wasn't just about reading dead languages. It was about feeling the emotional and cultural weight embedded in their sounds, their structures.
So the core question for this deep dive is really, how did the life of a quiet, pipe-smoking Oxford professor, a man who described himself as a hobbit in all but size, how did he produce The Lord of the Rings? I mean, it's often called the best-selling novel of all time.
And that's what we want to trace, those direct lines of comparison. Because when you look at his biography, what might seem like the, standard life of an early 20th century British academic, it's actually a series of really intense transformative events.
Right.
And critically, he didn't process these events through, say, contemporary literature or politics. He processed them almost entirely through creating new myth and new language.
So we need to see how the most mundane details and the most traumatic from his youth, war, how they became the land's characters, the conflict.
Exactly. It's all interwoven.
Let's begin at the beginning. Okay, so Tolkien's early life, it doesn't start in some cozy corner of England.
No, far from it. It starts in the Orange Free State, South Africa. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born there, January 3, 1892, in Bloemfontein.
Bloemfontein. Why South Africa?
His father, Arthur Tolkien, had moved there. He was a bank manager, basically seeking his fortune amidst the huge expansion of gold and diamond mining happening in the region at that.
And the name Tolkien, it's not typically English.
No, it's quite unusual. It derived from emigres from the Prussian part of Eastern Germany who'd moved to Britain back in the mid-18th century.
And this background, this seemingly minor detail, it actually caused some friction early on.
It did, yeah. It speaks volumes about the sort of deep nationalism in Victorian Britain. When Arthur wanted to marry Mabel Suffield, her father, John, strongly objected. Well, the sources say he was suspicious of Arthur's recent German immigrant roots. It reflected that common preference for what they saw as pure breed Englishness back then.
Wow. That idea of purity of lineage, suspicion of outsiders.
You see echoes of it all through Middle-earth.
Yeah.
The Hobbits' insularity, the way humans sometimes view elves or dwarves.
But they did marry.
Despite the resistance. Arthur was often away for work. Mabel had Ronald in 92, then Hilary in 94. But their time in Africa was pretty brief.
Right. Mabel decided to take the boys back to Burma. That was April 1895 on the SS Gulf. This wasn't just a visit.
No, it was more practical and cultural than that. Ronald was often sick, apparently, in the hot South African climate. Plus, there was a severe drought. It was widely believed to be bad English conscience. And Mabel really wanted to raise her boys in what she felt was a healthier, more culturally English environment.
And that journey back, it led directly to tragedy.
It did. Arthur was meant to join, but he never made it. He contracted acute rheumatic fever and died in February 1896.
So just like that, Mabel was a widow.
Instantly. And by all accounts, she became this extraordinarily strong, independent woman. She had to be.
Determined to give them the best upbringing, rejecting help from family.
Absolutely. And crucially, she started schooling the boys herself, taught them Latin, French, German. The sources are clear. Tolkien could read and write by age 4.
Age 4.
Yeah, that was the real start of his journey into studying the mechanics of language, how it works.
And she moved them around quick.
She did. Often looking for the perfect school, but the sources also say he was trying to escape the watchful and overly domineering gaze of her own parent. They had some deep religious disagreements.
Which brings us to Sarehole.
Yes, Sarehole in 1896, a small hamlet near Birmingham. If you're looking for the birthplace of the Shire, this is basically it.
This is where his love of nature really took hold.
Completely. His fierce love of trees and nature. There's that wonderful anecdote about him playing near Sarehole Mill, getting chased off by the miller.
Who he imagined as a troll. Right?
Exactly. It was a proper rural-ite, lush, quiet.
And the contrast. That's key, isn't it?
It's everything. Sarehole was this pocket of natural beauty, harmony, and just nearby was Birmingham, this hub of industrialized modernity. Tolkien said later he'd never seen a car until they left Sarehole. He really treasured that memory of untouched countries.
So even though he famous dislike.
You can see the pattern forming right there.
Yeah.
The heroes live simply, in harmony with nature. The villains corrupt, mechanize, destroy.
It's a foundational theme.
Absolutely. He apparently visited the mill later and found it shabbily destroyed, falling apart because of urban sprawl. He felt real sorrow. Sarehole is the garden that, well, Sauron, or maybe more accurately, Saruman, tries to ruin with industry later on. It's a core emotional and visual touch.
And the final piece of this early period, faith.
Yes. Mabel converted to Roman Catholicism in June 1900. This caused a major rift with her Unitarian father, who saw Protestantism as the only acceptable form of Christianity in Britain then.
But she stuck to her gun.
Unwavering commitment, even losing family support over it. Tragically, her health worsened. She moved the family again in 1904. The boys had measles, whooping cough, and then she was diagnosed with diabetes.
Which was a death sentence back then, before insulin.
Pretty much. She died in November 1904. Ronald and Hillary were orphans.
And her final act was crucial for their future.
Yes, ensuring their religious upbringing continued. She placed them under the guardianship of Father Francis Xavier Morgan.
Named after the founder of the Jesuits.
Right. This guardianship gave them stability, but it was also, well, quite restrictive, as Tolkien would soon find out.
You have to think about the emotional weight of all that loss. Twice orphaned.
And left clinging to the things his mother had instilled, especially language and faith. You could argue his later writing became a way of rebuilding the world that tragedy had kind of stripped away from.
Okay, so now he's under Father Morgan's strict care, back in Birmingham, near King Edward's. And this is where that academic passion really starts to flirt.
Yes, he first encountered Anglo-Saxon there, Old English, and that just sparked this linguistic fire in him that defined his whole life, both as a scholar and as an inventor of languages.
He saw the history in the words themselves.
Exact. How deep the roots of English went, how much culture was packed into the sound of a word.
And during these teen years, another huge event, he meets Brad,
his future wife. They were living in the same boarding house. Edith was 3 years older, also an orphan, and a talented pianist. Their friendship pretty quickly turned into romance.
Which Father Morgan did not approve of.
Not at all. He saw it as a serious problem, partly worried he was distracting Tolkien from his studies, but the sources also stress Morgan's major concern was that Edith was Protestant.
So he laid down the law. Sounds quite dramatic.
It does, like something from a Victorian novel. He forbade them from meeting or even writing until Tolkien turned 21, the very specific deadline.
Wow. That must have been incredibly difficult.
Heartbreaking, I imagine, but also maybe critical for his development. With that romance band, Father Morgan effectively channeled all of Tolkien's intense emotional energy, his creative drive, straight into his studies.
And into his friendships.
Right, leading directly to his first serious literary.
The TCBS.
The Tea Club. Later the TCBS Barrows Store. Formed around 1911 at King Edward's.
And this wasn't just lads hanging out.
No, it was a rigorous, highly competitive literary environment.
Yeah.
They'd smoke pipes, workshop their original writing, read classics.
In the original Greek, Latin, Anglo-Saxon.
Exactly. And they were tough on each other. Gave that kind of critical feedback that really helped shape Tolkien's perfectionism later.
Then in 1911, he gets into Oxford.
On a scholarship, yes, the Open Classical Exhibition to Exeter College, purely based on his extraordinary linguistic gifts, Anglo-Saxon, Greek, Gothic, ancient Germanic languages. It really cemented his path towards becoming a professor.
But his time at Oxford wasn't just about study. The world was changing.
Massively. The First World War breaks out in 1914. Now, unlike a lot of his friends, Tolkien chose to delay enlisting. He wanted to finish his degree first, which he did in 1950.
But he planned to join up with his TCBS friends.
Yes, in the Lancashire Fusiliers. He spent the time in between training as an officer and, crucially, writing poetry.
And here we see a split in his creative vision, right? He wrote Goblin Feet for Edith.
Yes, in 1914, it was whimsical, flowery, quite light. Became his first published piece in 1915.
But he came to hate it.
Absolutely despised it, called it the unhappy thing, said it represented everything he came to fervently dislike. Too twee, too much like the Victorian idea of fairies and elves. He was already moving beyond that.
Because something else was brewing. His real mythological work was starting.
Exactly. Around the same time, he wrote The Voyage of Arundel the Evening Star. That's the first poem you can really point to and say, this is Middle-earth.
And Ella, whose light ends up in the File of Galadriel.
That's the one. And the characters survive pretty much unchanged from this very early concept. Tolkien realized he needed a vast, deep mythological background to explain why a name like Arendelle should feel so ancient, so profound.
So trying to figure out the story behind the name kick-started the whole legendary.
That's how he described it. It initiated the wider mythology.
But duty called. He finally married Edith in March 19...
Right. She actually converted to Catholicism for the marriage to work, which caused a rift with her own guardian. Then, soon after, he was shipped out to the Western Front,
landing in France in June 1916, straight into the Battle of the Somme,
which started July 1st, 1916. As you said, one of the deadliest days in British military history, just horrific slaughter.
And the war hit him personally. Immediately.
Brutally. He lost TCBS members, Rob Gilson, G.B. Smith. The core of his creative support network was just decimated.
You can't really overstate the psychological impact of that.
No, I don't think you can. The TCBS had been this brotherhood, reinforcing his creative purpose. Losing them must have felt like confirmation that the world was entering this incredibly destructive, wasteful phase.
And the landscape of war.
The trenches, the mud, the poison gas, the shell holes. It's impossible not to see echoes of that in places like Mordor, the desolation of smog, those wasted, morally bankrupt landscapes.
But Tolkien himself didn't fight for long.
No, he contracted trench fever, a nasty disease carried by lice, apparently infected up to a third of British soldiers. He was hospitalized in France, then sent back to England to recover, had recurring bouts of it.
And this recovery period, this became crucial.
An absolute crucible of his creativity. While he was convalescing back in England, processing the trenches, thinking about the epics he loved, like the Finnish Kalevala.
Ah, yes, the Kalevala. Tell us more about that influence. It seems unusual for a British academic of the time.
It really was. The Kalevala is Finland's national epic, this huge collection of folklore and poetry put together in the 19th century. Tolkien adored it. Why? Because it had the exact tone, the deep mythological roots that he felt England lacked.
He wanted an English equivalent.
Precisely. So his early tales, like The Fall of Gondolin, Beren and Luthien, the stories that would become the core of the Silmarillion, they started emerging as he tried to create that equivalent, a mythology that felt ancient, authentic, linguistically coherent, and somehow.
So the language, the myth-making, and processing the trauma of war, it all finally started linking up.
Yes. This is where it truly begins to take shape. So the war ends, November 1918. Tolkien had been discharged after about 2 years of being in and out of hospital with illness. He and Edith had started their family. Their first son, John, was born in 1917.
And his academic career took off pretty quickly after that?
It did. In 1920, he got a post as reader in English language at the University of Leeds. And he found academic friends there, like Evie Gordon. They even formed a Viking club.
Inventing Anglo-Saxon song, keeping that TCBS spirit alive.
Kind of, yeah. That intellectual camaraderie, playing with language. And the family kept growing. Michael was born in 1920, then Christopher Royal in 1924.
Christopher, who would become so important later.
Hugely important. The editor, the disseminator of almost everything published after his father's death. And anyway, soon after Christopher's birth, Tolkien landed the big Anglo-Saxon professorship back at Oxford.
Returning to his alma mater, and this is where the academic bedrock of Middle-earth really gets laid down.
Absolutely. His day job, his scholarship, was steeped in Anglo-Saxon and Norse myth. His published academic work included things like a Middle English vocabulary.
A dictionary, basically.
Yeah, for the language from around 1100 to 1400. He also co-edited Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
The 14th century romance. Any links there to Middle-earth?
Well, it's subtle. But, the code of chivalry, the rugged northern landscape, that sense of courage facing the unknown. Some scholars see hints of the Rohirrim, maybe Aragorn's nobility, in there.
And then there's Beowulf.
Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon epic. He finished his own translation in 1926. Never published it in his lifetime, oddly enough. But his 1936 lecture, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, completely changed how people saw the poem.
How so? What was revolutionary about it?
Before Tolkien, academics treated Beowulf mainly as a historical document, useful for understanding old Germanic laws or tribal customs. Tolkien basically stood up and said, no, it's a work of art as poetry.
And he focused on the monsters.
Yes. He argued the monsters Grendel's mother, the dragon, weren't just plot devices. They were central to the poem's meaning. He focused on their psychological power.
Okay, so how does that connect directly to Middle-earth? You mentioned Grendel and Sauron earlier.
Well, look at the nature of their evil. Grendel in the poem isn't just a big brute. He's described as this ancient being of darkness, descended from Cain, filled with malice, hating the joy and community of the humans in the meat hall.
Almost motiveless evil.
Pretty much. And Sauron, his greatest evil isn't just his army. It's his corrupting influence, his desire to dominate free will, born from pure spite and a hatred of life itself. Tolkien was fascinated by that idea of ancient inherited evil lurking in the shadows.
So the lines between his scholarship and his fiction are just completely blurred.
Rather deeply interwoven. And it all comes back to philology, the love of language. We really need to get into how he built the world from language itself.
Right, because that's his unique method, isn't it?
It's the absolute core of his genius. See, most fantasy writers, they invent a world, then maybe they make up some words for places or things in it. Tolkien worked backwards.
How do you mean?
He invented the languages first, specifically his main Elvish languages, Quenya and Sindarin. He crafted their sounds, their grammar, and then he had to invent the people, the culture, the history that would speak those.
So he creates Quenya, High Elvish. It sounds maybe like Latin or Finnish.
Like very melodic, formal.
And then he asks what kind of people would speak like.
Exactly. What kind of majestic, ancient, refined people? And the answer necessitated the High Elf, the Noldor, their ancient history in Valinor, the whole vast saga that became the Silmarillion.
And Sindarin, Grey Elf.
That sounds different. More naturalistic, maybe a bit rougher, more like Welsh or Old English in feel. So, again, who speaks this language? Well, they'd be the more grounded forest-dwelling elf, the ones who stayed in Middle-earth.
The language dictates the race, which dictates the history, which dictates the story.
You've got a profound way to build a world, and it connects directly to that ambition he had to create an integrated mythology for England.
Because he felt England lacked?
Yes. He wanted something with the deep, unifying feel of the Irish or Finnish or Icelandic myths, but something that felt organic to England, to the clime and soil of the Northwest, as he put it. He drew on the fragments of England's linguistic past to build it.
And while all this academic work and private myth-making is going on, his social circle expands. Enter the Inks.
One of the most famous literary groups ever. He met C.S. Lewis Jack in 1926.
And the group really got going in the early 1930s.
Yeah, it included Lewis, a doctor named R.E. Havard, Lewis's brother Warren. Their bond was literature, obviously, but also a shared, deep commitment to Christianity. They'd meet, read their work aloud, debate theology, philosophy.
And there's that great irony, isn't there? Tolkien, the devout Catholic,
ends up being instrumental in Lewis, who'd been an atheist, returning to Christianity. But Lewis rejoined the Church of England, Anglican.
which Tolkien, as a Catholic, thought less of.
He did. But that whole dynamic just highlights how seriously Tolkien took his own faith and how he saw his creative work.
He didn't see it as just writing fantasy stories.
Not at all. He saw writing the Silmarillion and later Lord of the Rings as a kind of Christian duty and pursuit. He genuinely believed he wasn't just making things up. He was involved in subcreation, meaning he felt he was tapping into deeper truths, almost uncovering aspects of reality, much like an historian might uncover the past. He saw his creation as reflecting universal pattern, God's creation, but set in Earth's distant, imagined past, revealing human patterns through myth.
So that grand, almost theological vision for his mythology, it finally finds an anchor in something much almost accidental.
Yes, the famous Hobbit moment. This is around 1930. He's living at Northmoor Road in Oxford, where most of the Hobbit eventually got written.
And the story goes,
He's marking exam papers, school certificate exams, apparently quite tedious. He comes across a blank page left by a student, and just out of the blue, the complete sentence pops into his head. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
just like that.
Just like that. He scribbled it down, and that single, unassuming sentence, that was the seed for Bilbo Baggins and his whole adventure.
He was also a very involved father, wasn't he? Reading stories to his kids.
Oh, very much so. He had 4 children by then, John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla. He often read them stories, sent them illustrated letters from Father Christmas. While The Hobbit wasn't initially written for them, their enjoyment certainly encouraged him to keep going with it.
Didn't Tom Bombadil come from one of the children's toys?
Yes, apparently from a Dutch doll belonging to his son Michael. He even published a poem about Tom Bombadil in 1934, before The Hobbit came out.
Okay, so where did the idea of hobbits come from? What were the...
It's a funny mix, actually, quite eclectic. On one hand, there's literary satire. He was apparently inspired by Sinclair Lewis's novel, Babbitt.
The critique of American middle-class complacency. How does that connect to Hobbit?
Tolkien saw a parallel. He mentioned their bourgeois smug. Think about Bilbo at the start. Comfortable, respectable, maybe a little bit complacent. The whole adventure is about shaking him out of
But Tolkien also identified with them.
deeply. He famously said, I am, in fact, a hobbit. In all but size. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated. He loved that grounded, simple life he felt modernity was destroying.
Any other influences? More fantastical ones?
Yes, definitely. He acknowledged E.A. Weichsmith's book, The Marvelous Land of Snurg, which featured small, sort of sturdy, cheerful folk, and many names in the early drafts.
Like Gandalf.
Well, the head dwarf was originally called Gandalf. The wizard was called Bledorth. The names often came from Old Norse, specifically the Icelandic collection of poem, the Elder Edda. Smaug the dragon was originally Prif.
And Gandalf the Wizard, the image of him.
That came from a postcard he owned. An artwork by a German artist, J. Madlener, called Der Berggeist, the mountain spirit. It showed an old man with a long white beard, a wide-brimmed hat, and a staff communing with a faun in a forest. That became canon.
So The Hobbit starts as this private amusement, maybe partly for his children, he didn't even intend to finish.
Apparently not. He saw no reason to finish the story, as his children were growing up and perhaps losing interest. It might have just stayed in a drawer.
But thankfully,
a former student, Elaine Griffith, read the unfinished manuscript. She was connected to someone at the publishing house, Allen and Unwin, a woman named Susan Dagnall.
And Dagnall saw its potential.
She did. She encouraged Tolkien to finish it. After a lot of strenuous revisions, Tolkien was a notorious perfectionist. The Hobbit was finally published on September 21st, 1937.
And it was a hit?
An immediate success. Sold out by Christmas.
So naturally, the publishers wanted more Hobbit stories.
Exactly. The fans clamored for it. But Tolkien, his heart was still with the Silmarillion. He hoped this was his chance to get his grand mythology published.
But the publishers weren't keen.
No, they found the Silmarillion manuscripts too dense, too obscure, too mythological, too long, confusing, lacking the straightforward narrative drive that readers expected after The Hobbit.
So he started writing a sequel to The Hobbit instead, The New Hobbit.
Yes, but it quickly grew into something far bigger and darker. It became The Lord of the Ring. He had to merge the popular demand for hobbits with his own deep desire to explore his larger mythology.
And that merging process required some significant changes, didn't it? Retroactive.
Huge change. The story evolved dramatically over many years. Frodo, for instance, was originally called Bingo Baggins, and he was Bilbo's son, not his nephew.
Bilbo's son, why change?
The timeline just didn't work as the story got bigger and the history deep. Making Frodo a nephew gave him the right age and distance, and Merry and Pippin were initially Odo and Frodo took. The whole tone started shifting away from a children's story.
And the ring itself, that underwent the biggest transformation of all.
Absolutely critical. In The Hobbit, let's be honest, it's basically a magic trick, a ring that makes you invisible, useful for getting out of scrape.
But in Lord of the Rings,
it becomes the One Ring, the ruling ring, an instrument of cosmic evil, the linchpin of Sauron's power, an existential threat to all of Middle-earth.
So when did that change happen? How did he rework it?
It wasn't until he was well into writing The Lord of the Rings that he realized the ring Bilbo found needed to be that ring. This was a massive conceptual leap.
So he had to go back and rewrite The Hobbit.
He did, specifically the chapter Riddles in the Dark. In the first edition of The Hobbit, Gollum willingly bets the ring on the riddle game, and Bilbo wins it fairly straightforwardly. When he realized the ring had to be this object of immense power and corruption.
That original version didn't fit anymore.
Not at all. So in later editions, he rewrote it. Gollum is much more tortured, obsessed. Bilbo finds the ring by chance. And crucially, when Bilbo escaped, he tells Gandalf and the dwarves a slightly altered story about how he won it. Small lie.
Showing the ring's corrupting influence already.
Precisely. It shifted the tone fundamentally. That little plot device from a children's story became the central engine of moral struggle and potential world destruction in the sequel. It was an immense creative challenge, linking the two so profoundly.
Even small details got Sam Gamgee.
Yes. Gamgee was apparently a colloquial term for cotton wool in Birmingham, based on a surgeon named Gamgee who invented Gamgee tissue. But Tolkien also remembered meeting a curious, gossiping old man on holiday in Cornwall in 1932, nicknamed Gaffer Gamgee. So Samwise and his father, the Gaffer, got their names.
Amazing. The writing process took how?
About 12 years to write The Lord of the Rings, then another 4 years of revision. It was a mammoth undertaking.
And when it was finally done, the way it was published in 3 volumes wasn't his idea.
No, that was the publisher's decision. Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King. It was an artificial construction, as he called it, largely forced by post-war paper shortage. It was just too long and expensive to print as one book.
He originally saw it as 6 books in 2 volumes.
Yes, and he wasn't happy with the titles the publisher chose either. He particularly disliked The Return of the King. Thought it gave too much away.
What did he prefer?
The War of the Ring. And he famously grumbled about the Two Towers, saying he wasn't even sure which 2 towers it was supposed to refer to. Orthanc and Barad-dûr, or Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul, or Orthanc and Cirith Ungol.
Huh. And what about the Silmarillion, great passion project?
Still unpublished. The compromise was to condense a huge amount of that background mythology, history, and linguistic information into the appendices of The Return of the King.
A compromise, but it hinted at the vast surface.
Exactly. The full Silmarillion would have to wait for his son, Christopher, to eventually bring it to light.
We absolutely have to place the writing of The Lord of the Rings in its historical context. He's working on this epic expansion right as the world is heading towards another catastrophe.
Yes, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany from 1933, the escalating tensions, and then the outbreak of World War II in 1939. He was writing large parts of it during the war itself.
And for many people reading it, especially in the 50s and 60s, World War II was this stark clash between good and evil. You know, the Allies versus the Axis powers, the fight against fascism, the horrors of the Holocaust coming to light.
It seemed like a very clear moral conflict to many. So it's completely understandable why so many readers and critics immediately saw the saga as an allegory for World War II.
What are the main points of comparison?
Well, the obvious ones. Sauron is seen as Adolf Hitler, this figure of absolute consuming evil, bent on domination. The orcs are often read as the German army, the Wehrmacht, mindless, brutal hordes.
In the geography, Mordor is Germany.
Mordor is Nazi Germany, yes.
Yeah.
And the two towers, Isengard and Barad-dûr, perhaps representing Germany and a key ally, maybe Italy or even the Soviet Union before they switched sides, depending on the interpretation.
And the good guy.
The alliance that eventually forms between Rohan, Gondor, the elves, the dwarves, it looks a lot like the initially fractious Allied powers. Britain, the U.S., France, the Soviet Union eventually finding common cause against this overwhelming evil. It seems to fit quite neatly.
It does seem compelling, but Tolkien himself, he pushed back hard against it.
And vehemently. He stated very clearly, right in the foreword to The Lord of the Rings, that he cordially disliked allegory in all its manifestations.
Oh.
He insisted the story had no allegorical significance or contemporary political reference whatsoever.
That's a very strong denial. What did he mean by that if the parallels seem so clear? Is he just being contrary?
I don't think so. He drew a really important distinction, what he talked about often, is the difference between allegory and applicability.
Okay, explain that.
Allegory, for Tolkien, meant the author consciously imposes a specific secondary meaning onto the story. Think of Orwell's Animal Farm. It's clearly about the Russian Revolution and Stalinism. The author intends that specific parallel.
Right.
Applicability, on the other hand, resides in the reader. It's when the reader finds resonances or parallel between the story and their own life or historical events based on their own experiences.
So if a reader in 1955 saw Sauron as Hitler, Tolkien would say,
He'd say that's applicable.
Oh.
The story resonates with your experience of the war, but he would deny that he intended Sauron to be Hitler. He acknowledged that a writer's experiences inevitably shaped their imagination. The war certainly affected him, but his primary aim wasn't political commentary. It was mythological linguistics.
So if it's not primarily an allegory for World War, what's the alternative interpretation? What deeper critique is embedded in the story?
This brings us back to his earlier life, his love for Serhol, his dislike of industrialization. Many argue the saga is better understood as a critique of modernity itself.
Influenced by people like William Morris.
Exactly. Morris, the 19th century artist, writer, socialist, conservationist, who passionately rejected industrial ugliness and championed craftsmanship in nature. In this reading, the Shire is idealized pre-industrial England, simple, agrarian, close to the earth.
And the villains represent
Industrialization, mechanization, the destruction of nature for power and profit. Think about Sauron. His fall is explicitly tied to industrial process.
the destruction of Fangorn Forest.
Yes. Cutting down ancient trees to fuel the furnaces and forges of Isengard, building this mechanized army. It's a powerful image of nature being consumed by industry. Saruman's mind becomes a thing of metal and wheels. That's the horror Tolkien saw creeping towards his beloved countryside.
So Saruman is the critique of unchecked technological progress.
Very much. And his alliance with Sauron shows how that kind of thinking ultimately serves a greater evil. It's a deep critique of centralized power built on environmental destruction.
And where does Gollum?
Gollum is often seen as the ultimate victim of these malign influences. Not just of the ring's power, but of the covetousness and materialism it represents. He's ruined by obsession, by the desire to possess this one object.
The end product of a consumer society, almost.
You can see it that way. He's warped beyond recognition by his possessive. His tragedy is the spiritual cost of that all-consuming desire, making him a far more complex figure than just a simple monster. He's pitiable.
Okay, so it's not just about World War II. It's this complex tapestry.
Exactly. It's woven from Anglo-Saxon and Norse myth. Definitely echoes of biblical stories. Frodo, Sam, and Gollum have been compared to Jesus, Peter, and Judas. Clear parallels to his own war experience in this deep, consistent commentary on industrialization and the loss of connection to nature.
It's too big, too rich to be just...
Precisely. It started as this private mythological project, exploring deep themes about language, creation, good, evil, courage, sacrifice. Because it dealt with those universal human concerns, it naturally absorbed and reflected the great issues of his time, like war, industrialization, even if he didn't set out to write a direct allegory about them.
So insisting it's only about World War II kind of...
I think it misses the broader, more timeless critique of power and modernity that he spent decades building.
Okay, so The Return of the King comes out in 1955. The trilogy is complete. And the reaction. It wasn't just a successful book, was it?
No, it became a phenomenon. Maybe not overnight in terms of massive sales, but it quickly developed this intense cult following. By the 1960s, especially with the unauthorized paperback editions in America hitting college campuses,
It exploded.
it really did. Global fandom started popping up. You had the Tolkien Society forming in London, holding Hobbit picnics. There was apparently a Frodo Society in North Borneo. The reach was just incredible and, frankly, unexpected.
But Tolkien himself wasn't comfortable with this level.
Not at all. The sources are very clear on. He was a private academic man. He hated the intrusion fans phoning him at all hours, even showing up at his house in Oxford.
The quiet hobbit suddenly thrust into the limelight.
Exactly. He found it very distressing. Yet interesting, he still seemed to enjoy engaging with serious readers through letters. He'd write these incredibly long, detailed replies to fan mail, answering specific questions about language or lore, though apparently he often lost the drafts before post.
Classic professor. He kept writing and revising, though, still working on it.
Oh, yeah, constantly tinkering. He never stopped refining his mythology. In 1968, he and Edith actually retired and moved away from Oxford to Bournemouth, a seaside.
Why Bournemouth?
Partly to escape the constant attention in Oxford, which persisted even after he retired. And also, Edith's health was declining, and Bournemouth was considered a good place.
How long were they there?
About 3. Sadly, Edith died there in 1970. Her death affected him deeply. He had Luthien inscribed on her grave.
Luthien, the elven princess who chose mortality for love, linking their own story with all.
Yes. He later had Beren added for himself. After Edith's death, Tolkien returned to Oxford. Merton College gave him rooms, kind of like an honorary fellow.
And he received some official recognition in those final years?
He did. He was awarded a CBE Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1972, and Oxford gave him an honorary doctorate of letters that same. But it's notable, the doctorate was specifically for his academic work, his contributions to philology and medieval studies.
And for the Lord of the Rings?
Not primarily, no. The academic establishment still viewed his fiction somewhat separately. He died in September 1973.
And it's crucial to remember, as you said, at the time of his death, only The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were really published as complete narrative works set in Middle-earth.
That's right. All that vast foundational mythology, the Silmarillion, the linguistic material, the different ages of history, it was all still unpublished. Just mountains of note, drafts, revisions.
Which is where his son Christopher is in.
Yes. Christopher Tolkien became his father's literary executor. He took on this absolutely monumental task of sorting through, editing, and making sense of decades worth of complex, often contradictory manuscripts.
A true labor of love.
And incredible scholarship in its own right. He finally published the Silmarillion in 1977, 4 years after his father's death.
And was there still an appetite for it after all that time?
Huge appetite. It became an immediate bestseller. It proved people did want that deeper mythology. And Christopher didn't stop there. He went on to edit and publish the 12 volume of the history of Middle-earth.
12 volumes?
Yeah, meticulously tracing the evolution of the entire legendarium from the earliest sketches. It gave scholars and dedicated fans an unprecedented look into Tolkien's creative process.
So the cultural impact, it's almost hard to quantify, isn't it? The Lord of the Rings is often cited as the best-selling novel ever written.
Sometimes second only to the Bible, or maybe the Quran or Mao's Little Red Book, depending on how you count. Its reach is just pervasive. Think about pop culture.
The Beatles wanted to make a film.
Seriously. Considered it in the 60s. Lennon as Gollum, McCartney as Frodo, George Harrison as Gandalf, Ringo as Sam. Apparently Tolkien wasn't keen on the idea.
Huh. And Led Zeppelin.
Ramble on. The Battle of Evermore. Direct references to Mordor, Gollum, Ringwraiths. Even science took notice. Major features on Saturn's moon, Titan, are named after mountains, rivers, and characters from Middle-earth.
And then, of course, the Peter Jackson films.
Which were a cultural event in themselves. Won more Oscars than any other film series. Return of the King tied the all-time record with 11 wins. And now you have Amazon's Rings of Power series.
The biggest budget TV show ever made.
Just keeps going. But beyond the sheer scale, his biggest impact might be literary. He basically launched an entire genre of fantasy fiction on its own, as the sources say.
Modern fantasy owes him everything.
Pretty much. Authors like George R.R. Martin, Robert Jordan, countless others, they openly acknowledge their debt. The whole vocabulary of fantasy, hobbits, orcs, elves, dwarves, as we understand them now, that's largely down to Tolkien giving these concepts such depth and apparent reality.
Okay, one last point. The Nobel Prize. C.S. Lewis nominated him in 1961. Why didn't he get it?
It seems he was dismissed by the committee. The records suggest that in the early 60s, the Nobel Prize for Literature heavily favored works of social realism or philosophical angst. Think John Steinbeck, Jean-Paul Sartre.
So Tolkien's work was seen as?
Probably as just a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Escapist fantasy, not serious literature engaging with the important issues of the day.
Which, based on our discussion, seems like a massive misreading.
Complete. It utterly failed to appreciate the sheer scope of the historical and linguistic inquiry involved, the profound philosophical depth, the critique of power and modernity that's woven all through it.
They saw the surface, not the foundations.
Exact. The literary establishment largely viewed him as this slightly eccentric medievalist writing children's stories. They didn't grasp that he was constructing a mythology for the modern age, dealing with timeless themes of courage, loss, temptation, hope, themes that resonate perhaps even more strongly today.
Would he win it now, do you think?
It's impossible to say for sure, but with the greater critical respect now given to fantasy and speculative fiction, and a better understanding of the depth in his work, yes, I think he'd have a much, much stronger chance today. The world just needed time to catch up to what he'd built.
So what we've really seen today is how the unique, almost improbable path of J.R.R. Tolkien, from that orphan child in South Africa to the soldier who survived the horrors of the Somme to the Oxford professor obsessed with ancient words, how all that created the only kind of person who could have invented this specific mythology.
It really feels like that, doesn't it? His life experiences and his academic passions weren't separate tracks. They were completely fused. His work fundamentally shows that language carries history, and history becomes story, becomes myth.
And these myths he created, they seem to resonate because they touch on something deep, our connection to nature, a kind of folklore for a disconnected age.
I think so. They offer this sense of romance, maybe a yearning for simpler, quieter lives, lives more connected to the earth. It stands in stark contrast to the relentless march of technology and mechanization that Tolkien himself so deeply distrusted.
He saw Middle-earth, as you mentioned, as our own Earth, just in a different stage of imagination. We take that seriously. What essential truths about human history, about power, about industry, about trauma? What did this master philologist manage to uncover, or perhaps remind us of, through his myth?
That's the big question. He seemed intensely focused on the nature of courage, especially the courage of the small, the seemingly insignificant individual against overwhelming power, and maybe the corrupting nature of power itself.
So the final thought for you listening, if Middle-earth reflects patterns in our own world, what part of your modern life does it call into question? Does it challenge your ideas about progress, about heroism, or maybe just your relationship with the trees outside?
Something to ponder, Def. What does that long, difficult journey to Mordor really symbolize for us?